So in terms of what actually people mean when they say deliberative democracy, and part of the problem is that we've got all these different dry terms that kind of describe more or less a lot of the same kinds of activities. But generally, at least when I think about this stuff, what I think of is projects which are proactively reaching out to recruit large, diverse citizens to bring them to the table. So sometimes, in most cases, usually this is large, diverse numbers of people. Sometimes it's a more carefully and scientifically assembled random sample of people, but the idea is you want to get views of different kinds of people in the constituency to the table. Another kind of core ingredient of these things is that they're using process techniques, usually in small groups, increasingly now in online stuff as well, but they're using process techniques which give people a chance to really learn from each other, to kind of have their experiences validated, to give input, and to consider a range of views or options about whatever the issue is that they're discussing. And then a final thing which is emerging, I think, as a core principle of this work is that it's encouraging people to take action at a bunch of different levels. I mean, one level, of course, is policy change, and people kind of advocating for policy change or giving input to decision makers on the basis of their discussions. But there are many other levels. You know, people taking action as volunteers in terms of changing their behavior, in terms of being part of organizations and workplaces and faith communities and all kinds of other kind of ways in which they can do something about an issue. All of these things, though, I should say, I think all of this kind of work is propelled by a basic shift in what citizens expect and what citizens can do. And this is, I think, a global kind of a shift. That basically what you've got are people who are busier than ever. They have less time for public life or to be part of their communities, and yet they bring more to the table when they get there. You've got people who are feeling more entitled to the protection and services of government, yet less confident that government and other institutions are going to be able to deliver. And you've got people who are generally, in many cases, less connected to what's happening in their neighborhood or their community, but when they find an issue or a problem or an opportunity that they care about, they're better able to find the information, the allies, the resources they need to make an impact on that issue. So that's a huge shift, and it's all kinds of enormous complications and challenges that go with it for people who are working in institutions like local governments or school systems, but it also has incredible opportunities. A lot of them, what I'm going to give you in the next couple slides, does come from a fairly recent, quite recent research study that you can look at. It's called Bridging the Gap Between Public and Public Officials. But actually, I should say that these findings, I think, are probably fairly generalizable. That they come from all kinds of research, and I think they kind of match what a lot of us as practitioners know. That when this kind of work, in order for it to be credible, that it's got to be balanced and neutral, that it's got to be presented in a relatively nonpartisan way. The participants, as I said, must be diverse. The discussions must be well structured, civil, and informed. It has to kind of build trust and learning, and it has to encourage people in various ways to not just learn about issues, but to kind of deal with some of the complexities and to figure out what kind of trade-offs they're willing to live with and what kinds of directions they want to head. The good news about the research about this kind of stuff is that within these processes, the processes generally deliver. Okay. So when you study some of these kinds of things, there are different kinds of issues, generally you do find that people are learning. You generally do find that because they're structured, because they're facilitated, that the tenor of the discussions is generally respectful and civil. You find generally that people are able to kind of create and find some common ground, not always consensus, but at least common ground between different perspectives. And you usually see that people are able to kind of articulate some sense of the common good. Outside the processes are where some of the more difficult kind of areas are. And when these kinds of things fail, it's more on the basis of kind of how they were kind of organized as opposed to how the inside the discussions happen. One common failure is simply that of timing. That when people were engaged in something, the input, the recommendations they gave it was not the right point in the policy cycle where decision makers could actually take that input and run with it. So that's one fairly common failure. Another one is simply one of critical mass. That whatever it was, whatever project, how it was organized, it didn't influence enough people. Whether that means not enough people were in the deliberations themselves, or perhaps kind of the secondary effect, not enough people heard about it, not enough people were kind of informed through the media or through other kinds of ways what people were saying. And so they didn't kind of acquire that kind of critical mass that was necessary to generate the political will and kind of also the broad-based kind of problem-solving capacity to do something about the issue. And so the question of the political logic of this kind of stuff is always kind of a key piece that you always got to be dealing with. What I want to say, though, also, this is kind of going a step beyond, and to say that in general, what we've got, the history of this kind of work, what we've got are kind of temporary projects, generally of good quality, generally have good impacts, which are almost always temporary. And I don't know if this kind of fits some of your experience in places where you've worked, but it seems to be something that's emerging in a lot of places, that people do this kind of work to, to make decisions, to create a plan, keep more people working on an issue to build trust. Most of the time, when they kind of put the right ingredients in place, it succeeds. When they build that kind of critical mass, they're able to meet those kinds of goals. However, even in some of the most successful kinds of projects, you can go back to that neighborhood or that community several years later and really not find any changed relationship between citizens and government. The project may have worked to help to kind of settle the policy decision to make the plan, but it has not necessarily kind of changed that relationship. And there's all kinds of other challenges that I know a lot of us are quite familiar with. This kind of work, when you're bringing large numbers of people together in this kind of carefully constructed environment, that takes a lot of time and energy. And it's hard to sustain. It's not designed to be sustained. And it doesn't necessarily kind of lead to changes in trust or relationships that actually kind of endure over kind of the months and years after the project. If you look at some of the spectrums we use for this kind of work, I think you can see some of the strengths that I listed on the previous page and also some of the limitations. Now this is the one that I have gotten here from the Edmonton Public Involvement Manual, and it's, I guess, adapted from the IAP, the International Association for Public Participation version of this. And you can see that the way it's structured, it kind of assumes that government or some kind of decision maker is kind of initiating this, and that it's basically kind of the direction is coming from the left. And so that in some situations, some issues, all you need to do is share information with citizens. In other situations, you actually want to consult with them. In other situations, you want active participation. But it's set up kind of, I think part of the assumption here is that this is going to be mapped out over lots of involvement efforts over on all different kinds of issues. And it also, for me at least, kind of carries with it the notion that government is really the one responsible for doing this involvement. That it's their burden to burden the world. And what we've got to figure out is not just how do we do kind of recurring, temporary kinds of projects, but how do we kind of build some of this work much more sustainably in the way that communities function, so that people have kind of regular, structured, and enjoyable opportunities to connect with other people, to feel like they're part of a larger community, to bring some of their concerns and priorities to the table, to weigh in on concerns or questions that decision makers are bringing to them, and to feel like they're actually having a say in decision making and a hand in problem solving.